Two interesting data points I recently came across. One was a study by BCG that said 79% of executives now think that innovation is a top priority. McKinsey's study said 94% of CEOs are deeply dissatisfied with their company's innovation performance. Like, there's no other area of business performance where that gap, I think, is that wide. My experience is that a lot of people, a lot of CEOs who say they're serious about innovation really aren't. Because when you go down to frontline employees, administrative assistants, tech support, call centers, whatever, and you ask them, number one, have you been trained as a business innovator? Have you been trained to think about unmet customer needs? Have you been given the creative tools of business entrepreneurship? And then you ask them, well, if you have an idea, is it very relatively easy to compete for experimental capital? Do you have an internal, kind of version of Kickstarter where in a matter of days, you know whether somebody's gonna, and the answer is no. In most companies, capital is still allocated Soviet style. It's a monopoly. There are not multiple sources of experimental capital inside like you find today with crowdsourcing. And then finally you ask frontline people, is it clear to you that your manager is responsible for innovation? Are there KPIs, number of ideas, quality of ideas, but is it clear that they are personally accountable for innovation in a way that influences their compensation? And frontline people tell you no and no and no. And then I go back to the CEO and say, okay, let's start again and understand how you're using the word serious here.
Yeah.
So anyway.
Yeah. Good point. Good.
But I think increasingly the goal is not to have a change program, but to build a change platform that allows people to come together and solve these problems collectively in ways that we simply can't do individually. Change only happens when you have a leader who wants to change, and then you start to mobilize ordinary individuals. And so one of the great tools that leaders have today, and this is what we've been using, is you can take these problems and you can start to outsource them to the whole organization. So I start to create a lot of pressure from the top. We know we need to change. This is no longer tenable. And a lot of pressure from the bottom. Let's make something different happen. And then you trap the folks who don't want to change kind of in the middle of that sandwich. Vineet Nair of HCL Technologies told the story last night in a dinner about going out and asking every single employee at HCL to give him a performance review. Well, he didn't start by saying, let's change the way we do leadership evaluation, let's get the HR people, because I can tell you his vice presidents would have had a huge amount of resistance. You do it. You mobilize the organization, then other people have pretty much no choice but to follow along. Team members know what is impeding their capacity to innovate. What's getting in the way of their ability to generate ideas, to get funding, whatever it may be. And if we've learned anything from design thinking, it should be this, that everything starts with the users. Organizational transformation starts with the users as well. It's hard to change deep realities top down. There are too many around you who can slow walk your reforms. They will feign agreement with your aims, but then passively resist real change. In relative terms, the CEO has a lot of power, but in the context of an organization of tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of individuals, not so much. So that's why you have to crowdsource organizational transformation. You have to ask a broad cross-section of team members what gets in your way to innovate, to adapt, to move faster. Because when 50 or 100 individuals say this rule is stupid, or why is it so hard to get experimental capital, then no small cadre of executives can hit the mute button. So we need to abandon once and for all the idea that change is something that cascades. Change needs to roll up, not roll out. So when you look at some of the benchmarks, you see again and again that the returns on investing in people, on increasing their level of discretion, on helping them think more like true business people and business owners, that investment pays off again and again and again. But what it takes, and I think this is the very difficult thing, it takes a fundamental rethink about where power lies in an organization.
So as you said, it's asking the C-suite to do this is like asking turkeys to vote for Thanksgiving. So how do you do it? I mean, the examples that you cited, and you didn't go into detail. Who is it? Is it a founder, CEO who has to lead change like this, or how does it?
So a couple of very, very quick thoughts. One is, I actually think it can start from anywhere, and I think you might be hearing some stories later in the Drucker Forum. But we have taught people in our organizations to be helpless. We've taught them that you cannot change the system unless you own the system. And I think that's just rubbish. You know, when a young person comes to me and says, Gary, you have the ear of the leaders, we think our HR system sucks, or something else we need to change, can you help make this point? I always say no. I say, well, what you have to say when you have an idea, the first impulse cannot be to go up. The first impulse is to go across. The first impulse is to build a coalition. Find people who share your passion. Get them to show up on a Saturday morning. Put a white paper together. Do a prototype. Because leaders have a very easy time saying no to one person, because one person's often wrong. But if your idea has survived the scrutiny of your peers and you've engaged them, which you can now easily do through social media, leaders have a very difficult time saying no to a large group of people. I will tell you, systemic problems usually don't get solved systemically. They get solved, if you look at change throughout the world, they happen when somebody is willing to stand up and make a start, wherever they are. And I've long been kind of surprised and disappointed that as many CEOs talk about change and the need for change, almost none of them talk about activism. And how do you train employees in your own organization not to be anarchists, not to be terrorists, to be activists? Activists are not content with mediocrity. They are not bound by their job description. They have a great sense of responsibility for making things better. They do not assume they're helpless. They do not start by asking permission. They are not stupid, right? They're not foolish, but they often are quite fearless. And I think that's where change starts. It changes with every individual going back and saying, what did I learn from this conference? What's an idea that I can use? How do I bring people around me? How do we make a difference? All out of proportion to where you sit in the world. And when you approach that task with courage, when you're willing to tackle problems that are way bigger than your pay grade, when you approach it with a contrarian spirit and you're willing to challenge conventional thinking, and when you come at it with true humility and compassion, when the people around you know you are in it for them and in it for making life better for the colleagues around you, I will tell you what, you can do amazing things that will shock and surprise you, and you will leave the world a better place. I think there are a lot of people in organizations today who think the idea of changing these big organizations, making them more flexible, more creative, and more inspiring places to work, that challenge seems to them like that should be somebody else's problem. There's an incredible amount of learned helplessness in organizations, and I see this in a lot of conferences I go to, not necessarily this one, but you'll see CEOs get up there and talk about some amazing thing they did in their organization. You go like, well, wow, that's interesting, you're the CEO. And then you have people, maybe like some of us out of academia or whatever, who will tell people how to be more effective in your role, how to be a better leader, how to be a better manager. What you almost never hear is somebody telling you how to change the system when you don't own the system. Right? How do you change HR, finance, IT, whatever, when that's controlled, you know, by people, you know, somewhere up in the corporate tower? But if you have that sense of helplessness, you will never change anything. It happens from activists. And so for me, you have to start thinking about yourself as an activist. You know, deep change never has started top down. It just doesn't happen that way. We've been opening up a conversation with tens of thousands of people simultaneously and asking them, what is it that stands in the way of you innovating? Is it access to resources? Is it time? Is it Slack? Is it good mentorship? Is it customer insights and so on? And I think a lot of times CEOs are fairly nervous when you say, what we're going to do is we are going to involve the whole organization in retooling our processes so they're more innovation friendly. My experience has been when you ask people what stands in the way and then you ask them, how do you fix that? They are very thoughtful about it. Most people love their organizations. They want it to succeed. My experience is that when you give people responsibility and accountability for engineering the systems by which their lives at work are managed, and you tell them we have to be simultaneously good at operations and good at innovation and adaptable, they rise to the challenge and they'll surprise you. You know, the problem with so many top-down change programs is the solution space is limited by what a few people at the top can imagine. You know, Amazon has said, we want to be the world's biggest laboratory. We're simply going to try more things than anybody else, meaning product and business innovation. I think you have to take the same thing when you start to think about how do you retool your management model. It's a matter of saying, we're going to have to experiment. My experience is when you open that conversation up to people, when you make them smart about the underlying principles that we need to build into our DNA, and you ask them how, they will surprise you. And it's incredibly constructive, and there's, you know, very little negative energy that I've seen in that process. buried within the notion of change management are 4 self-limiting beliefs. Within change management, 4 self-limiting beliefs. The first belief is that there's an assumption that only a few people, a small number of people, have the right to initiate change, while most don't. But how is anything ever going to change if the people who are in charge of change are over-invested in the past, as they often are over-isolated from the future, as they often are? That's why most change programs are actually catch-up programs. Second self-limiting assumption is that change cascades downwards. This virtually assures that change will be resisted. When both the means and the ends of a change program are prescribed and sent down, you can bet that it's not going to be embraced. And then change leaders take comfort in the thought that people are against change. You know, it's complete rubbish. People are not against change, they're against royal edicts. Third, there's a belief that change can be engineered, like a large-scale construction project or an IT overhaul. And finally, there's an assumption that change is episodic, that it exists, between long periods of stasis. But today, anything that's frozen for long becomes irrelevant. So I would argue we got to change the way we changed. What's needed is not a change program, but a change platform and something more like a giant hackathon.
You're not opposed to the idea of the big corporation, but you think it needs to change. Again, can this be done? People cling to these institutions. We can't rule out human nature in saying I've got to hang on to what I've got.
No, I think it's one of the biggest challenges we face. I've been involved in organizational transformation initiatives for more than 30 years. I only have one lesson to share from all that experience. And that is, if you think organizational transformation is a rational process, you have lost. If you think that all you have to do is do all the analysis, get the data, put it on charts, share it with everybody, and mobilize everyone forward, you've lost. The one lesson I have is organizational transformation ultimately is a profoundly political process. The only thing that matters in organizational transformation is finding ways to identify and neutralize the enemies of change, and there are enemies of change, the ones who have power today, and to identify and strengthen the champions of change. And as long as possible, I'm a big fan of the art of war. If you have to engage in direct conflict with the enemy, direct battle with the enemy, you've lost the war. The antibodies within or institutions today are extremely powerful, and they will do everything possible to crush change.
Fredmund, what about the persuading employees who aren't ready, the lack of readiness internally? It's a bit like my first question. But
I mean, after some decades of working with people in business, but not only there, also in politics, administration, etc., my estimation is that about 2/3 of the people do want to change. They seize the opportunity, they want to get better, they want to have organizations which are doing better jobs, using less resources, etc., etc. Maybe there is 1/3 who don't. Okay, so I try to identify those who want and run with them. And I do not much care with the others. See, that's my strategy, so to speak. Counting on the fact that the good example will work for its own. It will convince people that it is possible to do it in a peaceful, in a non-violent, and in a more or less, not, as I said, not without any sacrifices, but with minimizing them. And I think this is the best thing you can do. There may be all sorts of conspiracies out there. People like to or do not like to change, but I do not care that much about them at the present moment. See?
You know, I was talking a few weeks ago, I was talking to the head of sales, again, for a very large internet company you guys would all know, that you'd think would be in front of all of this social media and so on. And they'd recently changed the compensation model and the compensation practices for their entire sales force. And it had provoked an avalanche of backlash and anger and resentment, and the Twitter was alive with all of the frustration. So I asked this executive, I said, well, did you blog about this first? Did you, what needs to change and why? And here are a few ideas. He said, no, that would have taken too long. We had the consultants in, and we went from here to implementation in 3 months. I said, there's a big difference between speed to implementation and speed to success, right? And now you're finding out what that difference is.